I was grabbing coffee with a colleague yesterday, a guy named Arash. He's a senior structural engineer here in Berlin, the kind of professional who usually spends his mornings obsessing over bridge tolerances and urban planning. But yesterday, he wasn't looking at blueprints. He was staring at a digital map of the Turkey border, his thumb hovering over the screen with a quiet, vibrating intensity. We were sitting in a neighborhood that still has refugees welcome stickers fading on the lampposts from a decade ago. At the table next to us, two men were complaining loudly about the spike in gas prices and how expensive it's getting to heat their apartments. Arash didn't seem to hear them. He looked up at me and said something that felt like a cold draft in the warm cafe. My parents are retired doctors. They have a home in Shiraz and a garden they spent 30 years planting. They never wanted to be a statistic. But this morning, my father asked me if I still have the hiking boots I used in the Alps. That moment hit me because it stripped away all the abstract headlines about unprecedented magnitude and arithmetic. A year ago, the idea of a mass exodus from Iran was a geopolitical what-if discussed in hushed tones in Brussels. Today, with 90 million people living under the shadow of a widening war and the Strait of Hormuz effectively closed, that what-if has become a when. What's striking is the disconnect. In the halls of power, you have Friedrich Merz doubling down on military support, while Pedro Sanchez warns that Europe is playing Russian roulette with millions of lives. But on the ground, the narrative is shifting from empathy to frantic bracing. We like to think we learned everything there was to know from the Syrian crisis in 2015, but looking at Arash, a man who represents exactly the kind of success story Europe claims to want, I realized we might have learned the wrong lessons entirely. We've become experts at debating where to put the razor wire, but we've lost the ability to hear the footsteps before they reach the fence. The question for 2026 isn't just whether the borders will hold. It's what happens when the people coming toward them have nothing left to lose but the shoes on their feet.
Yeah, I mean, that disconnect you're talking about, it's staggering. To really grasp the sheer scale of it, we sort of have to pull our focus away from the physical borders for a minute.
Right, because the border is just where it all spills over.
Exactly. The physical reality of the border is just a symptom. The actual disease here is complete political paralysis, and you see it perfectly if you look at the administrative heart of Europe right now.
Like the actual offices where these policies are supposed to be written.
Right. Let's look at the daily reality of a mid-level strategist working in the European Parliament complex over in Strasbourg.
Okay, Marcus.
His physical workspace is basically this tangible manifestation of a continent that just cannot formulate a coherent response. He's working in this windowless office. The air conditioning has this constant low-frequency hum.
Sounds incredibly bleak.
Yeah. And the main feature of his office is his desk, which is basically a graveyard for half-empty espresso cups. Yeah. And it is completely buried under 3 massive color-coded policy manuals.
Wait, 3 different manuals? Ooh.
From different coalitions of EU member states. And the thing is, they aren't complementary at all. They represent these radically hostile, mutually exclusive visions of what a unified strategy should even look like.
So he's supposed to synthesize a unified response out of inputs that fundamentally contradict each other? I mean, that's like asking him to defy the laws of political physics.
It's an impossible task. Yeah. Let's actually break down what's in those manuals. So the first one, it's bound in this heavy red cardstock. It's aggressively pushed by the Eastern member states.
And what's their angle?
It operates entirely on a doctrine of absolute containment. Like, it doesn't even bother with processing asylum claims on European soil.
So no processing at all?
It's entirely focused on the financial mechanics to fund extraterritorial camps. You know, paying third-party, non-EU nations to just intercept and hold these displaced populations before they ever reach the physical borders of the EU.
Wow. Okay, so that's the red manual. What about the second one?
The second one comes from states that are facing these catastrophic demographic cliffs. And their document is all about high-speed, targeted integration grants.
Wait, so they actually want people to come in?
Yeah, but only specific people. It outlines mechanisms to rapidly identify, vet, and basically siphon off highly educated professionals, engineers, doctors, IT specialists, to plug the immediate holes in their domestic labor markets.
Well, that immediately presents a huge contradiction. I mean, if the first manual demands everyone is kept in extraterritorial camps outside the EU, how does the second manual propose to extract the specific skilled labor those aging economies need?
Exactly.
You can't simultaneously seal a border hermetically and operate a highly selective, high-velocity recruitment pipeline through that exact same border.
And the contradiction just gets deeper when you look at the third manual, because this one basically abandons the concept of managing human beings entirely.
What does it manage then?
budgets. It's just a dry, exhaustive ledger of austerity measures. Its entire goal is to strip funding from domestic social cohesion programs and redirect billions into advanced border surveillance tech, militarized enforcement infrastructure.
So Marcus is just sitting there in this windowless room with these 3 impossible documents.
Yeah. And his phone never rings. The political leaders in the capital cities are totally consumed by domestic polling, just trying to survive in their coalitions. They leave the bureaucrats with 0 executable directives.
Just a buzzing fluorescent light and no answer.
Right, and it gives him this dull, pulsing migraine. He actually spends his afternoons obsessively cleaning this smudge on his glasses that just will not come off.
That's almost poetic, right? It's a persistent physical blur that mirrors the systemic blindness of the whole continent. They can't decide if they're building a fortress or sanctuary. It makes me think they're operating like a committee of architects tasked with reinforcing a dam, but they're trapped in the site office arguing over the formatting of the blueprints. Meanwhile, the river outside is already pouring over the concrete spillway. The structural integrity is compromised, and they're debating typography.
And this administrative paralysis, it comes from a geopolitical fracture that is so much deeper than what we saw during the 2015 crisis.
You mentioned the division over Operation Epic Fury earlier, the U.S.-Israeli military campaign against Iran. Let's map out how that fracture actually looks across the European leadership.
Sure. So the fracture is fundamental because it touches the core of their national security doctrines. Take Germany, for instance. Chancellor Friedrich Merz has positioned Germany in close alignment with the U.S. and Israel.
Viewing it strictly through a security lens.
Exactly. From Berlin's perspective, decades of complex diplomacy and economic incentives just entirely failed to stop Tehran's regional destabilization and its nuclear ambitions.
So they see military action as inevitable.
Yeah, Merz calculates that a kinetic degradation of Iranian military capabilities is just a necessary requirement for long-term global security, even if it's highly disruptive right now. So Germany is providing implicit political backing for the operation.
I get the logic of the security lens, but when you cross the Pyrenees into Spain, that logic is completely rejected. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez isn't just offering mild pushback, he's actively obstructing it.
Spain's strategic geography is critical for U.S. force projection into the Mediterranean and the Middle East, specifically the naval base at Rota and the air base at Meron.
Right, and Sanchez is refusing to let them use those bases.
Flatly refusing. He won't authorize the use of those installations for any operations linked to the strikes on Iran, which is a massive logistical hurdle for the Pentagon.
Even with all the diplomatic pressure the U.S. can throw at them.
Even when the U.S. threatened to downgrade bilateral relations, Sanchez didn't pivot. His calculus is deeply tied to domestic politics, but also a totally different reading of Mediterranean security.
That's where his warning about playing Russian roulette comes in.
Exactly. He argues that decapitation strikes don't create security. They create a massive, uncontrollable power vacuum.
Yeah.
When he says Europe is playing Russian roulette, he means it's a mathematical certainty that a collapsing state of 90 million people will send shockwaves directly across the Mediterranean,
destabilizing North Africa and crashing straight into southern Europe. For Spain, the military operation is manufacturing an existential crisis right on their doorstep.
So you have the largest industrial economy supporting the act and a critical southern border state actively obstructing it.
Where do France and the UK fit into this? Historically, they usually try to build a diplomatic bridge, but a conflict moving this fast, a bridge seems impossible.
They're trying these incredibly complex, honestly contradictory maneuvers. Emmanuel Macron in France is using a highly legalistic strategy. He argues that military action outside international law without a UN Security Council mandate undermines the global order.
So he's demanding emergency sessions in New York.
Yes. But simultaneously, Macron operates under this doctrine of strategic autonomy. He's deployed French aircraft carriers and naval strike groups to the Eastern Med and the Gulf.
Wait, he's condemning the military architecture while actively deploying French military mass
to protect distinct French national assets and energy interests.
So he's reading the rulebook to the room while simultaneously loading a weapon under the table. What about the UK? Because Prime Minister Keir Starmer has to balance the U.S. alliance with a really volatile domestic situation regarding the Middle East.
Starmer's position is practically a masterclass in the friction between alliance obligations and domestic survival. The critical asset for the UK is the Diego Garcia military base in the Indian Ocean.
The UK controls it, but they lease it to the US military, right?
Exactly. And it's an indispensable staging ground for long-range strategic bombers targeting Iran. Initially, under intense pressure from his own party, Starmer tried to restrict the U.S. from using Diego Garcia for offensive sorties.
I can imagine Washington did not react well to that.
The backlash was immediate and severe. So Starmer had to execute this rapid, humiliating walkback, reauthorizing the base, but trying to categorize the sorties under this highly ambiguous definition of defensive operations.
Which infuriates his domestic base and also degrades trust with the Pentagon.
And then look at Poland. President Karol Nawrocki views this entirely through the lens of Eastern Flank defense against Russia.
So for Poland, keeping the U.S. happy is the priority.
Absolutely. Poland's strategic imperative is maintaining the U.S. security umbrella. Supporting U.S. objectives in Iran is basically the currency they use to ensure U.S. support in Eastern Europe. So Warsaw gives full-throated backing to Operation Epic Fury.
Let's bring this back to Marcus and his windowless office. The architects aren't just arguing over blueprints, they are actively attempting to demolish each other's foundational pillars. Merce demands structural reinforcement. Sanchez is blocking the supply trucks. Macron is filing legal injunctions while building a private bunker. Starmer won't decide if he's inside or out, and Nawrocki wants all resources diverted to the back fence.
It's total administrative paralysis. And amidst all this, the EU actually managed to draft a document to address migration.
Right, the EU's new pact on migration and asylum. How does this mechanism even function when the member states fundamentally despise each other's strategies?
Well, to understand the new pact, you first have to understand the catastrophic failure of what it replaced, the Dublin system.
The Dublin regulation, yeah.
The Dublin system operated on a fatally flawed geographic premise. Whichever EU state a migrant physically enters first is entirely responsible for processing their asylum claim.
Which means geography dictates liability. Germany or Sweden are insulated because they're surrounded by other EU states. But Greece, Italy, and Spain have to absorb everything just because they have a Mediterranean coastline.
It mathematically guaranteed that frontline states would collapse during a mass influx, which is exactly what happened in 2015. The Greek and Italian systems totally disintegrated.
So the new pact was supposed to fix that geographic liability.
But because the political divisions are so entrenched, the pact abandons any pretense of a humanitarian proposition. It's an architecture engineered purely for bureaucratic deflection. And the core mechanism is something they call flexible solidarity.
Flexible solidarity. That sounds like an oxymoron designed by a PR firm. I mean, if solidarity is flexible, it isn't solidarity, it's an opt-out clause.
It functions essentially as a financial derivative market for human liability.
How does that actually work when a frontline state asks for help?
So if Greece reaches a critical threshold of applications and its infrastructure starts to fail, they trigger a solidarity mechanism. The other 26 states are legally obligated to contribute. But flexible solidarity means they choose how they contribute.
Yes. They don't have to actually take people in.
Right. A state can choose to physically relocate a quota of asylum seekers. But if they refuse, because it's politically toxic at home, they can fulfill their obligation by just writing a check.
So they can financially offset their obligation to human beings. Where does that money actually go? To build better facilities in Greece?
No. The funds are heavily weighted toward capacity building and externalization. So a state can pay millions into a pool that funds rapid deportation flights. Or they can finance border infrastructure sensors, walls, drone procurement.
In the frontline states.
Or even more controversially, they can fund operations in third countries entirely outside the EU, paying North African or Middle Eastern governments to intercept and detain people before they reach the Mediterranean.
So the pact literally legally codifies the ability of a member state to purchase immunity from migration by funding the mechanics of exclusion.
Yeah.
But if you read the thousands of pages of this pact, there is this glaring, deliberate omission. It builds this highly complex, multi-billion-euro architecture for irregular migration, but there is no framework, no roadmap, no expanded quotas for legal migration. They build a wider moat, but deliberately refuse to build a bridge.
It's the defining hypocrisy of the European political establishment right now. I mean, from an economic standpoint, the European Commission has these internal white papers explicitly detailing severe labor shortages.
Yeah, we've all seen the demographic data.
Right. Yet politicians refuse to integrate legal pathways into the pact because the optics are considered fatal. To set up legal visa processing centers in transit countries, a politician would have to stand up and admit that the state desires and requires an influx of foreign nationals.
And in an environment dominated by hardline rhetoric and anxiety over cultural cohesion, that's just political suicide.
Total suicide. So the bureaucracy just ignores the legal avenue. They pretend migration is solely a security threat to be repelled, not an economic inevitability.
But cause and effect doesn't pause for political optics. If a government dismantles legal avenues while desperately needing the people trying to enter, they aren't stopping migration, they're just forcing it underground. If a highly skilled professional in a war zone can't access an embassy because the digital portals are suspended, they don't just sit and wait for a bomb. They liquidate their assets and find a smuggler. The administrative paralysis in Marcus's office is the direct cause of the primitive survival scenarios on the borders.
That causality is absolute. When the legal path is erased, human capital is forced into the illicit market. It completely transforms how Europe interacts with the exact demographics it needs.
Which brings me to another individual I researched for this deep dive. Let's call him Arash. Totally different from my colleague in the cafe. This Arash is an electrical engineer. Until the conflict expanded, he was in Isfahan, designing complex, high-voltage power grids. He represents the apex of technical human capital.
A demographic profile that perfectly aligns with the shortages in Germany and Sweden's industrial sectors.
Precisely. But look at his current physical reality. He's not in a corporate recruitment office in Frankfurt. He has jagged, black dirt permanently wedged under his fingernails.
Because he was digging a sleeping trench.
With his bare hands. In the freezing mud along the banks of the Evros River between Greece and Turkey. And inside his waterproof rucksack, wrapped in plastic, is this high-end aluminum laptop full of complex electrical schematics and proprietary software.
Which is completely useless.
Exactly. It's just 2 kilograms of dead weight. The battery drained days ago, and there is no electrical grid in the forest.
The image of a structural engineer hauling dead technology through a muddy trench. It's a stark representation of human capital being systematically reduced to zero.
The degradation is physical and psychological. These are hands that were manipulating delicate microcircuitry weeks ago. Now he's shivering so violently from hypothermia that he can barely pry open a rusted tin of cheap sardines he bought from a smuggler.
At a massive markup, probably.
1,000% markup. And the bitter irony is, he turns on the smuggler's burner phone he shares with 5 other people. Through the static, he catches European radio broadcasts from across the river. He's sitting in a thicket of thorns to avoid drones, listening to European tech CEOs bemoan the aging workforce and the desperate need to attract global technical talent.
The juxtaposition is just staggering.
Arash is the literal embodiment of the skilled migrant Europe says it needs. He has the knowledge to modernize their power grids. But in that moment, the EU is spending billions on high-altitude thermal imaging drones with FLIR cameras, actively sweeping the canopy to hunt him down like a hostile invading force. Europe desperately needs his brain, but they are utterly terrified of the physical human being carrying it.
And this paradox, it's not an isolated incident. It's the defining structural feature of this impending exodus. We are witnessing an unprecedented, catastrophic drought of highly skilled technical labor from Iran.
Tell me about the data preceding the current military escalation, because this started before the bombs, right?
Before the kinetic strikes began, Iran had a highly developed digital economy valued at about $45 billion. E-commerce platforms, complex fintech, ride-sharing networks. But that entire sector is experiencing total structural collapse.
Just evaporating.
Yeah, the migration observatories tracked it. A staggering 50% of everyone involved in Iran's startup community and 44% of university students and recent tech grads have either fled or are liquidating their assets to leave.
A 50% brain drain of an entire nation's tech sector? What were the mechanical push factors before the airspace even closed?
The environment for innovators had been systematically engineered to be unlivable, primarily through the state's national information network, basically a hermetically sealed national internet.
Severe internet censorship.
Right. Deep packet inspection, IP blocking. If you're a software developer relying on open source libraries or cloud computing, basic digital work became impossible. You can't build a modern digital economy on an isolated, monitored connection.
And how did the economic environment compound that?
It was punitive and unpredictable. But the ultimate catalyst was macroeconomic collapse. The devaluation of the Iranian rial meant domestic tech firms couldn't compete with global salaries.
Because their money was essentially worthless on the global market.
Exactly. If an elite engineer stayed in Tehran, their absolute ceiling for compensation, adjusted for hyperinflation, was maybe $2,000 to $3,000 a month. That same engineer working remotely for a company in Berlin or Silicon Valley commands 10 times that. The economic gravity was immense. It just violently pulled the talent outward.
And this exodus didn't just hurt the economy. It created massive vulnerabilities within the Iranian state apparatus itself. If you hemorrhage 50% of your experts, who is left to defend your critical digital infrastructure?
No one with the requisite capability. The loss of cybersecurity talent was catastrophic, and it showed up in severe failures long before Epic Fury began.
Like what kind of failures?
We saw highly sophisticated cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. Hackers breached the national railway systems, altering digital train schedules to display anti-regime messages. Total logistical paralysis.
Wow.
They penetrated the national fuel distribution network, disabling payment systems at thousands of gas stations simultaneously. Municipal websites were wiped. The state lost the ability to defend its digital borders because the people who knew how to patch those vulnerabilities were already sitting in Istanbul or trying to survive the mud of the Evros River.
So you have a collapsing state bleeding its vital talent. And then you pan back to Europe and you see a continent facing an equally severe, totally different structural crisis.
The demographic cliff.
Exactly.
Right.
It's no longer a theoretical projection for 2050. The dependency ratio retired citizens relying on active workers is becoming unsustainable right now. We have acute labor shortages, exacerbated post-COVID, agriculture lacks manpower, heavy industry can't find machinists, and the specialized tech sectors are stalled because they can't source engineering talent to compete with the US and China.
It's an absolute contradiction. Europe's economic architecture is practically begging for the exact demographic currently fleeing Iran. They need engineers for the green energy transition, medical professionals for the aging healthcare system, and developers for digital competitiveness.
Which requires us to question the fundamental logic of the entire European border apparatus. What is the actual economic or strategic logic here? Why does a continent facing a demographic crisis spend billions of taxpayer euros on military-grade drones, armed guards, and razor wire specifically to hunt down the exact innovators they claim are essential for survival?
It makes no sense economically.
Why demand that a structural engineer risk drowning in the Aegean Sea or freezing in a trench just to prove his worth before he's permitted to design the power grids we desperately need years later?
If you're looking for economic or strategic logic, you won't find it. The logic driving this system is exclusively political. The migration discourse is completely captured by the visceral optics of security.
It's all about how it looks on television.
Exactly. For a European head of state, political survival isn't predicated on solving a 10-year labor shortage. It's predicated on demonstrating immediate muscular control over physical borders.
Because thermal drone footage of a heavily secured fence plays well to an anxious electorate.
Right. It provides the illusion of control. Meanwhile, a long-term policy that establishes legal pathways and actively integrates foreign engineers offers no immediate visual triumph. It's complex, it's weaponized by the opposition, and it takes years to yield economic dividends. The raw political fear of an uncontrolled influx overrides the rational mathematical need for human capital.
But the devastating irony is that while they obsess over securing the physical border, the actual existential threats to European stability are macroeconomic and geopolitical. A border wall cannot intercept a shockwave in the global energy markets.
It definitely cannot.
The displacement of people like Arash doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's the direct output of a massive military escalation that is simultaneously strangling the energy security of the exact same European citizens demanding higher walls.
And that's it. The refugee wave is a secondary effect. To understand why 90 million people are at displacement risk, we have to dissect the macro-level mechanics of Operation Epic Fury.
Let's examine that military doctrine, because analytically, it looks like a profoundly high-risk strategy that totally ignores historical precedents.
Defense analysts are calling it regime change on the cheap. The U.S. administration's objective is to fundamentally collapse the Iranian system from within, without committing the immense capital required for a conventional ground invasion.
And the mechanism is decapitation strikes.
Yes. Utilizing advanced intelligence and precision-guided munitions to eliminate the highest echelons of Iranian leadership, which they successfully achieved with the assassination of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and senior figures in the Revolutionary Guard.
And the theoretical calculation is that Removing the command structure creates a power vacuum that sparks a domestic uprising.
Right, causing the regime to fracture under internal pressure. The paramount constraint of this strategy is avoiding American boots on the ground.
Regime change on the cheap. The phrase is so clinically detached. If you look at the Middle East over the last 30 years, creating a sudden power vacuum through external military force rarely results in a clean transition to a stable democracy. It invariably results in protracted chaos, factional warfare, and massive civilian displacement.
And the current operational reality shows this isn't going to be swift or surgical. It's already devolved into a protracted war of attrition.
Because the regime didn't just capitulate.
No. Facing an existential threat, the remaining command structure is retaliating asymmetrically across the region, activating proxy networks, launching ballistic missile barrages. And this tempo is draining Western resources. We're seeing a critical depletion of U.S. and allied munitions like Patriot and SM-3 interceptors.
They just can't produce them fast enough to match the consumption rate of defending against sustained drone swarms.
Exactly. But while the military logistics are straining, the immediate shockwave hitting Europe is economic.
The energy choke point. Because Iran's geography dictates the flow of a vital artery of the global economy. Let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz.
The strait is incredibly narrow, only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, separating Iran from the Arabian Peninsula. Due to the kinetic conflict, anti-ship missiles, and mining, the strait is currently, for all practical commercial purposes, entirely closed.
And it's not just closed because of a physical naval blockade. It's about the mechanics of the global insurance market, right?
Yes. Commercial shipping is governed by actuarial mathematics. When missiles start flying, organizations like the Lloyd's of London Joint War Committee categorize it as an active war zone.
Which means the war risk insurance premiums skyrocket.
The premium can jump from a fraction of a percent to 2 or 3% of the total value of the massive oil tanker and its cargo for a single transit. Mathematically, it renders the voyage financially ruinous.
So a shipping conglomerate will just refuse to send vessels there because the risk of losing a $100 million asset is too high and the insurance wipes out the profit. The ships just stop moving.
And to understand the gravity, 1/3 of the world's seaborne crude oil and a quarter of the global supply of LNG has to physically pass through that 21-mile corridor.
1/3 of the global oil supply trapped behind actuarial risk and cruise missiles. And the macroeconomic fallout was instantaneous.
The markets reacted with immediate violence. Global benchmark crude spiked by 10% almost overnight. But for Europe, it's exponentially more dire. Because Europe pivoted heavily to LNG imports after severing Russian pipeline gas, a disruption in the Gulf is catastrophic. European natural gas prices surged by 50% practically instantly.
And the military operation actively targeted physical infrastructure, too.
Yes, U.S. and Israeli forces executed precision strikes against the Karg Island fossil export terminal, which handles over 90% of Iran's crude exports. The goal was to sever the regime's revenue. But in retaliation, Iranian forces struck critical energy facilities in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, trying to broaden the economic pain globally.
This circles right back to the two men sitting next to Arash and me in the Berlin cafe. When they are complaining loudly about the crippling cost of heating their apartments, they are experiencing the direct mechanical downstream effect of a missile strike on Karg Island and the subsequent algorithms of Lloyd's of London. They are feeling Operation Epic Fury in their utility bills.
It's all connected.
And this level of economic disruption forces a massive realignment of global power dynamics. How are Russia and China maneuvering within this chaos?
Well, the Kremlin is quietly yet immensely benefiting from every aspect of it. Economically, that 10% spike in global oil prices is a massive windfall for their war economy. And the disruption in the Gulf means a desperate increase in demand for Russia's heavily discounted shadow fleet oil.
Let's clarify the mechanics of this shadow fleet. How does a massive oil tanker hide in plain sight to evade sanctions?
It's a complex logistical dance. Russia uses a vast fleet of aging tankers, operating under flags of convenience registered in countries with lax maritime oversight. They systematically disable the ship's AIS transponders, making them vanish from tracking radar. They conduct ship-to-ship transfers of crude in international waters, pumping oil to a nominally neutral vessel mid-Atlantic. They forge customs documents, blending the Russian oil with crude from other nations to mask its chemical signature. By the time it reaches a refinery in Asia, its origin is laundered.
And the conflict supercharges the demand for this laundered oil. Strategically, this is a huge victory for Moscow because it diverts Western resources and attention away from Ukraine. But what about China? They are totally dependent on external energy.
China is on an incredibly precarious diplomatic and economic tightrope. Publicly, their Ministry of Foreign Affairs strongly condemns the decapitation strikes, framing it as a blatant violation of the UN Charter. They're playing the defender of the rules-based order.
But beneath the rhetoric, their overriding concern is energy security.
Exactly. This is their Malacca dilemma expanding into the Gulf. China imports roughly 15% of its crude oil from Iran, usually at steep discounts. They desperately need to protect those physical flows. But they can't take a hardline military stance that alienates their massive trading partners on the other side of the Gulf, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who are caught in the retaliatory crossfire.
So they're forced to watch their primary energy corridor become an active war zone, and their leverage is severely limited.
Right.
This forces us to confront a fundamental flaw in the domestic political debates happening across Europe. You have populist politicians campaigning on isolationism, promising they can insulate their nations simply by constructing higher walls and deploying more drones. But a biometric fingerprint scanner cannot stop a 50% surge in global natural gas prices. If Europe's industrial base and domestic social stability rely on affordable energy, does an extended military conflict in the Middle East actually pose a vastly greater existential threat to European stability than the refugees fleeing it?
That is the critical question the political discourse deliberately ignores. The focus is obsessively trained on the physical movement of human bodies, treating refugees as the primary vector of instability. Meanwhile, the actual macroeconomic foundations of the continent are being actively eroded by the war generating that movement.
And the tragic irony is that the massive border apparatus Europe has built isn't designed to address the root causes or even process the human reality of it. It's engineered almost exclusively to manage the visual optics for a domestic audience.
Which brings us to the final and, frankly, most chilling aspect of this. We need to compare the physical reality of the Syrian crisis of 2015 with the sterile technological reality waiting for the Iranian wave of 2026.
Right, let's look at this through the experience of Lucas, a veteran social worker.
Yeah, Lucas has been deployed in European migration management for over a decade. If you talk to him about the autumn of 2015, his narrative centers entirely on the physical reality of the Munich Central train station.
I remember those broadcast images from 2015. Trains discharging thousands of exhausted people, met by ordinary citizens handing out water and teddy bears.
When Lucas recalls it, he describes an overwhelming sensory experience. The sharp smell of unwashed bodies, the damp scent of wet wool coats, the deafening acoustic volume, thousands of fragmented conversations, announcements, crying infants.
But underneath the chaos, there was a palpable sense of hope. Civil society mobilized directly at the point of arrival.
Fast forward 11 years. Today, Lucas is stationed at a newly constructed, integrated processing center on the extreme periphery of the EU. And the contrast is absolute. This facility is engineered as a clinical, high-tech purgatory. The chaotic crowds of the Munich platforms are completely gone.
The defining characteristic is silence.
Silence and profound, crushing moral exhaustion. He sits in a sterile, temperature-controlled observation room, surrounded not by people, but by banks of advanced biometric scanners, facial recognition monitors, and the constant hum of server racks.
The physical human element has been systematically stripped away.
Eradicated. There is no smell of wet wool. He interacts with the crisis entirely through screens. He watches the silent, red, blinking lights of motion sensors on fences kilometers away. The system has evolved to take desperate human lives and translate them into grainy, white-hot infrared heat signatures on a digital map.
Billions spent on algorithms that haven't solved the crisis merely sanitized it, sterilizing the interaction to protect bureaucracy from the emotional weight of its own policies.
And that sterilization is terrifying because the scale of the human displacement currently building dwarfs 2015. Iran has a highly educated, highly urbanized population of 90 million people. The EU Asylum Agency's predictive modeling is stark.
What's the fundamental math?
If a protracted state collapse triggers a displacement rate of even 10%, which is conservative, that represents a sudden movement of 9 million individuals. If even a fraction of that targets the European exterior, it triggers an unprecedented logistical crisis.
9 million people entering a system politically paralyzed over fractions of that number. How are individual capitals reacting to that projection?
With panic and fortification. Germany is highly defensive. They already host an established diaspora of 320,000 Iranians, which historically acts as a magnet for new arrivals. But the German political establishment has been explicit. Their municipal infrastructure and housing markets simply cannot withstand a repetition of 2015. They fear the political center would buckle under pressure from far-right factions.
What about Northern Europe?
Even more absolute. Sweden, operating under the Taido Agreement, issued an outright preemptive refusal to accept the burden of a new crisis. They declared their societal integration capacity exhausted, actively dismantling previous asylum support structures to deter arrivals.
But keeping with the theme of a fractured continent, Spain is doing the exact opposite.
Yes, Spain is the glaring outlier. Madrid recently moved to aggressively regularize the status of up to 500,000 undocumented migrants already in their shadow economy, focusing on rapid labor market absorption. But that's an isolated anomaly. The dominant posture of the EU is defined by what sociologists call the architecture of apathy.
The architecture of apathy. When politicians claim they learned the lessons of 2015, what did they actually operationalize?
They didn't learn a humanitarian lesson about equitably distributing the burden across 27 states. They learned that visible chaos at the borders destroys political careers. So the migration apparatus evolved with a singular objective: push the physical suffering out of the visual field of the electorate.
That's why the budget for Frontex exploded into the billions.
Massive investments in digital modernization, thermal drones hunting Arash, expanding Eurodac biometric databases, automated behavioral analysis, and massive reliance on third-country partnerships.
Using economic leverage to pay non-EU governments in the Balkans or North Africa to construct and manage holding camps.
Right. Intercepting people before they legally set foot on European soil. The entire architecture transforms a massive human crisis into a digital ghost. If the suffering happens in the freezing forests of the Evros River or an extraterritorial camp, or as an infrared blip on Lucas's monitor, it doesn't generate chaotic footage for the evening news. The political optics are protected.
So we have to interrogate this political narrative of preparedness. Heads of state are assuring citizens, we are prepared. We will not experience a repeat of 2015. But if Europe's definition of being prepared simply means hiding the human cost behind biometric scanners and international bribery, if it means deploying a drone to turn Arash into an anonymous heat signature so a citizen doesn't have to watch him freeze in the mud, then the core crisis hasn't been solved at all. The continent has merely built a highly complex, multi-billion-euro technological wall to clinically sterilize the optics of its own political and moral paralysis.
The operational reality of 2026 is that the crisis remains entirely unsolved. Its physical manifestation has simply been technologically and geographically displaced. The intersecting mechanisms we have detailed today are now rigidly locked into place. The European continent remains deeply politically paralyzed, constrained by internal doctrinal fractures and an asylum pact that mathematically prioritizes bureaucratic deflection over both human realities and domestic economic necessities. Simultaneously, a protracted grinding military escalation in the Middle East is systematically strangling global energy choke points, guaranteeing severe, unavoidable macroeconomic blowback that will erode European industrial stability. And as the mathematical certainty of millions of displaced individuals forces them toward the Mediterranean, they will not be met by a cohesive, strategic, humanitarian, or economic response. Instead, they will encounter a cold, heavily modernized border apparatus that has been engineered exclusively to keep their physical suffering out of sight.